Mid-March 1945. The largest armada to ever sail under a single nation made their approach to the Ryukyu Islands. Their target? The island of Okinawa, a key location for the eventual build-up and invasion of Japan. Opposing them were about 100,000 determined Japanese soldiers and conscripts, willing to give their lives to prevent an American victory. The fleet was the most powerful ever assembled. There was nothing like it before, and there's been nothing like it since. It had over 40 carriers of various types. Task Force 58, the elite carrier force of the U.S. Navy, was led by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher and featured veteran carriers such as Essex, Enterprise, Bunker Hill, and Intrepid. The air crews and pilots in the task force were the elite of the elite, contenders for the best pilots in the world. Many of the pilots were veterans of dozens of engagements: Coral Sea, Midway, the Santa Cruz Islands, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf. They had attacked Japanese installations hundreds of times, flying on both sides of the equator several times in a week in some campaigns. They had hundreds upon hundreds, if not thousands of hours of flight time. The aircraft were also some of the best to ever be produced. The F-6F Hellcat is a strong contender for the best fighter plane in the war, rivaled by other American planes such as the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the F-4U Corsair, all of which shattered the conception that the Japanese Zero was the best fighter in the Pacific. With other planes such as Avengers and Helldivers, the U.S. Navy was undoubtedly the most powerful naval force to ever exist. Battleships in 1945 were old news, but their powerful guns could still sink any ship that was in range. Besides that, the 1945 U.S. battleships were modified for ground support. Their guns were more than capable of, in U.S. Navy personnel words, crack concrete bunkers open like walnuts, and this armada had about 20 of them. Also in the fleet were dozens of cruisers, heavy and light, not to mention hundreds of other ships, including destroyers and destroyer escorts, LSTs, oil tankers, troop transports, rocket ships, ammunition ships, minesweepers, and medical ships. 9 out of 10 ships in the fleet were non-existent before Pearl Harbor, a testimony to American industry. The Americans were in awe of their fleet. In every direction there were ships. There seemed to be no end to the hundreds of ships present. Marine Dick Whitaker was astonished. There were ships to the horizon, truly an awesome number. I couldn't have imagined that this many ships existed in the whole world. The Japanese were too impressed, if not a little jealous. One Japanese soldier said, "I can't make out the water. It's 70% ship, 30% ocean." An Okinawan conscript noted that if those ships decided to fire, the tiny island of Okinawa would be wiped off the map. Shu Ikamayagi, a librarian from Naha, now a member of the Okinawan Home Guard, was somewhat shocked when his comrades still insisted that victory was around the corner. He noted that some of the men did have their doubts, though. Many cried themselves to sleep, worrying about their families. To match the impressive, innumerable force, the Japanese would need to be fanatical, if not a bit lucky. And in March 1945, a U.S. Navy fleet carrier found itself in a very unlucky situation. The USS Franklin, or known to her crew as Big Ben, had spent time striking Japanese targets, including those on Kyushu, in support of Operation Iceberg. She was 55 miles away from Kyushu on the early morning of March 19th. At 0700 hours, after spending day after day bombing with tired pilots and crew, the ship was taken down from General Quarters to Condition 3, so everyone could relax and get a hot meal. Hundreds of sailors, pilots, and air crews were soon grouped together. Dozens of parked, fully fueled planes lay in the hangars and on the deck. Bombs and munitions lay on the aircraft or nearby. Radar picked up no Japanese aircraft in the area. But at 0708, a Japanese dive bomber was spotted on approach, 1,000 yards ahead of the Franklin. It made its run and dropped 2 bombs right on the deck. The bombs crashed through the deck and exploded. Combined with fueled-up aircraft sitting on the deck of the ship, caused a chain reaction with hundreds being killed instantly. Many were blown off the ship. 500 men standing in the hangar deck area were incinerated, leaving only 2 survivors, one of which is named Eldon Rogers, whose birthday was that day. On the nearby destroyer, USS Hunt, sailors could see men being blown off the ship. Among the men being blown off the ship and jumping, men could also be seen running around on fire. Damage control teams sprang into action, but the damage was incredible. Soon the Franklin lost power and forward momentum and was dead in the water. Joseph T. O'Collin was the ship's chaplain, a physics professor at Boston College, and a Jesuit who had served in Operation Torch. He was a committed man. Right after the crash, he sprang into action. Firstly, by administering last rites to many of the dying men. He then led some sailors to bombs on the ship that were in danger of going off. Together they got rid of them, throwing them overboard. Lieutenant Donald Gary was an engineering officer. After Franklin was hit, he led 300 men to safety in 3 different trips. He then led a team to the boiler room and prepared the ship for towing. For both of their actions, both men would be awarded the Medal of Honor, O'Callaghan becoming the first Navy chaplain who earned the honor. Even with veteran damage control teams, it was unclear whether the massive carrier would be able to survive. Other ships, such as the Santa Fe, came to assist. Destroyers came alongside to take on men trapped by the fire. The ship then started listing, in which we get this iconic photograph. The ship's surgeons were also all killed, causing even more chaos. In a testament to their skill, the crew of the Franklin managed to regain control of the situation and stabilize the ship. Among the Medal of Honors, 21 Navy Crosses and 26 Silver Stars were also given out, showing the courage of all involved. Overall, it was a nightmare. Out of a crew of 2,600, 807 sailors died, about 500 were wounded, and the rest were scattered, either blown off the ship or caught on board. Franklin then started to limp back to Ulithi and then Pearl Harbor. It then made its way to the New York, Brooklyn naval yards. Why not the West Coast? Well, because all those ships in those facilities were being repaired from kamikaze attacks. Franklin stank like rotten and burned flesh for the entire journey home. As Franklin was hit, literally 2 minutes after it was hit actually, the veteran carrier Wasp was also hit, but she suffered far less damage than the Franklin. The Ryukyu's campaign had barely even started, and the Japanese had just damaged 2 carriers. While the Americans still had about 40 other carriers, including British carriers, it was still a very heavy price to pay. Back off of Okinawa, a couple of objectives needed to be completed before the main landings could start. First off, carriers had already started to launch strike missions on Okinawa, but not in any one place as to confuse the Japanese. If the Japanese and Okinawans thought the previous October raid was bad, these raids were far worse. They were so powerful, accurate, and common that the Japanese were forced to move supplies and troops during the night. Anti-air fire did not stop the Americans. But the Japanese gained a newfound respect for their opponents, who braved the anti-air fire like it was non-existent. In total, Task Force 58 flew about 3,100 sorties before the invasion. Ships started firing on coastal targets that were available to them. Japanese and Okinawan defenders were sometimes lifted up from the ground and slammed back down into it repeatedly. That's if their position wasn't destroyed entirely. Pictures were also taken of Okinawa, as there was a lack of them in American intelligence. Even with aircraft taking photographs, not all the information would be available to American forces. The Motobu Peninsula and Aishima were somewhat completely overlooked. While some areas in central and southern Okinawa did not show the Americans as much as they wanted. Among the dozens of operations occurring, there is always one taking place out of sight of both the US Armada and the Japanese. That was the Underwater Demolition Teams, or UDTs, frogmen and predecessors to today's Navy SEALs. No frogman was allowed to speak to anyone outside his unit about his actions, so they're sometimes overlooked, but they are undoubtedly one of the most important resources at the US Navy's disposal, and they would carry out what is sometimes called the largest underwater sweep in history. A couple years earlier, the US Navy learned the hard way about coral and tides in amphibious landings. At Tarawa, a reef had prevented landing craft from being able to make it to shore. Marines, in turn, had to wade through about 700 yards of open water to make it to safety, being shot at by machine guns and rifle fire upon their approach. At Tarawa, one could tell what wave of the landing a corpse was in, purely based off of how bloated and sunburned the corpse was. It was a tragedy of the greatest kind. The American public was outraged. A grieving mother actually wrote to Nimitz, directly blaming him for her son's death. This could never be repeated. The answer is to use some of the most skilled swimmers and divers in the US Navy. Some of the men in their ranks were known to be half fish and half crazy. The frogmen swam right up to the Hagushi beaches to determine what the situation was. taking minor fire in their approach. They reported that the beach could support Amtraks and heavier landing craft in certain locations at high tide. The frogmen would also clear about 2,900 stakes embedded into concrete and coral that were around the Hagushi beaches. Minesweepers also started their sweep, destroying 257 mines in about 6 minefields. But the destroyer Halligan, unfortunately, struck a mine and sank, being one of the first naval losses in the waters of the Ryukyus. The Kerama Islands were important to the Americans. This group of islands provided a natural anchorage, so ships could repair and rearm. The group of islands could also provide a base for anti-submarine warfare, or ASW, and other operations, such as search and rescue. The Americans decided to take them, in what would be the first official landing of the campaign. Men from the U.S. 77th Infantry Division would make the landing. The 77th Infantry Division, or the Statue of Liberty Division, was activated during World War I. 7 of the division's companies made up the famous Lost Battalion from the war. The division was reactivated and fought at Guam and in the Philippines, where it earned a reputation for being a reliable division. On March 26th, the first official landings on Japanese soil took place, with 5 battalions of infantry landing at the major islands. In total, 15 islands would be captured. Most were taken easily, but some resistance took place. Japanese troops and Korean laborers made desperate attacks, and were mostly all wiped out, even though some 77th Infantry Division units did find themselves in hand-to-hand combat. Some disturbing events also occurred. U.S. forces had seen Okinawan civilians killing themselves, and had seen bodies of civilians Japanese soldiers had murdered. The civilians were terrified of the Americans, who had been fed years and years of propaganda about how the Americans were savages and murderers who wanted to torture civilians to death. Toyoko Azama was a young girl and a witness to these events. She saw people blowing themselves up with grenades. A man killed his family with a hatchet, and she saw a mother kill her own daughter with a gardening tool. Her uncle detonated a grenade while surrounded by his family. Most of these were on Takashiki, where the Japanese soldiers rounded up about 1,000 civilians. They were ordered to hand over all their food and commit suicide, which many did, using grenades, razors, sickles, rocks, and rope. The 77th Infantry Division's 306th Regiment heard all the commotion the night after the landing. They heard explosions and the screaming of women and children. The next day, they found 250 civilians, dead or dying. Those who survived were astonished, as the Americans gave out food and cigarettes. Medical care was also given out to the wounded. Some Okinawans were so upset about the tragedy that they tried to murder several of the Japanese soldiers who were captured. These suicide cases were absolutely disgusting and disturbing, and they sent chills throughout the American command. But they were very uncommon, and most civilians survived. Surprisingly, there were actually a decent amount of Japanese forces who did surrender, even higher ranks, such as lieutenants and majors. Some of these men, thankfully, prevented the suicide of some of the other civilians. On March 28th, the islands were declared secure, all except Takashiki, whose Japanese soldiers hid in the hills and refused to surrender. They had an unofficial truce with the Americans, though, not to attack one another, and mostly ignored each other for the rest of the war until they surrendered. U.S. Navy Seabees then started building, transforming the islands into their base. Among what was captured included as many as 350 suicide boats, in which the Japanese planned to attack in conjunction with massed kamikaze attacks. In total, losses were about 530 confirmed Japanese killed, with more taken prisoner, and about 31 American killed and 81 wounded. With these islands secured, the Americans made ready to land. April 1st was the date chosen and was renamed from D-Day to L-Day as to distinguish it from other invasions. It also fell on Easter Sunday and April Fool's Day. For the landing, the U.S. Navy, Marines, and now the Army did not want to make the same mistakes that took place a couple months earlier on Iwo Jima. Okinawa was to be targeted for one of the largest bombardments in history. Battleships, destroyer, cruisers, and new rocket ships would all fire in support combined with carrier strikes by the fleet's best pilots. Strong points such as bunkers were to be wiped out. Locations where resistance was expected were to be flattened. Napalm was going to be dropped as to clear vegetation and kill any Japanese hiding. Carrier strikes and naval support was to be on constant standby to help the troops on the beaches wrestle control from the Japanese. After this bombardment, 4 divisions, The 1st and 6th Marine Divisions and the 7th and 96th Army Divisions were to land and take their objectives. Even with all the support available, the first wave was expected to be annihilated with an 85% casualty rate. This eventually spread through the fleet, and obviously the men in the first wave were all terrified. Upon securing a beachhead, American forces were to fight their way across the island and capture the airfields, then advance and cut the island in half. Marine forces then would take the north, Army forces then would head south. Another warning came the day before the landing. Admiral Spruance's flagship, Indianapolis, was struck by a kamikaze. 9 sailors were killed, and Spruance transferred to a new command ship, the battleship New Mexico. Unknown to Spruance, this ship would too be hit by a kamikaze later on in the campaign. The battleship Nevada was also hit around this time, and so were the destroyers O'Brien, Dorsey, Kimberly, and Porterfield. I'll talk more about kamikazes at greater length at another point in the series. The night before L-Day, everyone was nervous. Among the thousands of men storming Hagushi was Ernie Pyle, who had been with the American forces when they stormed Omaha Beach, among other campaigns such as Anzio and Sicily. Anyone with any sense is nervous on the night before D-Day. You feel weak, and you're trying to think of things, but your mind stubbornly drifts back to the awful thoughts of tomorrow. Generally speaking, this is how tens of thousands of Marines and soldiers felt on March 31st. April 1st, L-Day, Easter Sunday, and April Fool's Day. Sunrise at 0621 hours. Temperature 74 Fahrenheit. 5 to 7 mile visibility with smoke and haze. Moderate east-northeast winds. Sea conditions, light, no surf on the beaches. High tide at 5 feet 11 inches at 0900 hours. At 4:06 hours, the order was given to land the landing force. 10 battleships, 9 cruisers, and 23 destroyers, and hundreds of smaller craft such as PT boats and rocket ships opened fire at the Hagushi beaches. Joining them were elite pilots of Task Force 58. A fake landing by the 2nd Marine Division also took place on southern Okinawa. The bombardment was one of the largest and most concentrated in human history. It felt as if the world was exploding and gave everyone splitting headaches. All who were watching were perfectly confident not even insects could survive such punishment. Everything from anti-aircraft fire to rockets to heavy caliber battleship guns were being used to fire on the beaches. The beaches were so filled with smoke that you couldn't even see them, but the ships kept firing anyway. While there was no attempt to contest the landing by the Japanese, Okinawans and Japanese soldiers were caught up in the bombardment. One Okinawan conscript had this to say: "The bombardment's gunsmoke and dust cloud changed the sky to yellow. The shells, shot from hundreds of battleships, cruisers, and destroyer batteries, numbered the thousands and tens of thousands a minute. The Japanese army, on the other hand, kept silent and did not fire a single shot." Miles away, the Japanese command watched the bombardment take place. Ushijima was impressed and was thankful he was not contesting that landing. Japanese officers were also impressed and joked on how they would love to see the faces of the American commanders once they realized the landing was uncontested. In total, 45,000 shells would be fired, along with 33,000 rockets and 22,500 mortar shells in support of the landings. The Army and Marine forces, meanwhile, had the usual all-you-could-eat buffet with steak and eggs. Although no one was hungry, many were concerned with what was to come, and very happy with the bombardment. As the bombardment was occurring, hundreds of ships and smaller craft maneuvered in place and readied themselves for the landing. They took on troops and prepared themselves for the battle. One naval officer wrote, "We had all seen the landings in the movies, but the real thing is more spectacular than I have ever dreamed of. The precious bombardment of the beachhead by scores of planes, the monotonous shelling of the shoreline by huge wagons, wave after wave of LBTs, small boats, etc., heading into the island, constituted a display so formidable and awe-inspiring, I never shall forget it." At 0759, the first wave left the line of departure, some 4,000 yards away from the beaches. In between the waves sat amphibious tanks, supporting the invasion. The feeling of terror of being in the first wave is inconceivable. Veterans from previous campaigns, such as John McMillan, which was his 5th landing, felt nothing but terror. So I figured this had to be my time to get it. I'd been too lucky so far. Everyone was nervous with tension. For Ed Jones, his birthday was on April 1st. I knew about Iwo. I thought it was going to be a very short 19th year. At exactly 2 minutes before the boats landed, all naval fire stopped, basically on a dime. The only noise now was the sound of engines and distant explosions as the bombardment shifted and creeped forward. Everyone expected this to be the worst fighting yet encountered in the Pacific War. But it was April Fool's Day. Taylor Kinney, the leader of a machine gun platoon, sums it up best. As our boats were racing toward the rising sun, there was no firing. All was quiet except for the roar of the boat's motor and the slapping of waves against the open boats. The ramp splashed down, and I ran into the knee-deep water, followed by a boatload of Marines. Still, there was no shooting. I thought they were just waiting to see the whites of our eyes. I then plugged my way through a narrow row of bushes. There were Japanese gun emplacements. Empty. What kind of trick is this? The whole situation was eerie. For Eugene Sledge and the Marines in his platoon, it was a massive relief. When we overcame our astonishment, everyone started laughing and joking. The release of tension was unforgettable. We sat on the edge of the Amtrak's troop compartment, singing and commenting on the vast fleet surrounding us. It was, and still is, the most pleasant surprise of the war. Literally everyone was surprised. In a radio message to Nimitz, Admiral Richard Turner, in charge of the landing operation, reported, "Practically no fire against boats, none against ships. Troops advancing, standing up." Marine Corporal David McPherson couldn't forget his experience either. No one believed it. "Why, this is just like one of MacArthur's landings. We don't have to crawl. Happy Easter," we started cheerfully calling to one another. Ernie Pyle, who had been at Anzio and Omaha Beach, had this to say. "Never before have I seen an invasion beach like Okinawa. There isn't a dead or wounded man in my whole sector. Medical corpsmen were sitting among their sacks of bandages and plasma and stretchers with nothing to do. The carnage was wonderfully and beautifully not there." Robert Sherrod, a Time magazine correspondent who had been at the landings of Tarawa, which I previously talked about, and Iwo Jima, noted that the Americans faced slightly more opposition than they would have in maneuvers off the coast of California. To say merely that they were bewildered is to gild the lily of understatement. Everyone was stunned. Minus an occasional sniper or mortar round, it had gone perfectly. About 28 men were killed, though, and 80 wounded, out of nearly 60,000 landing before darkness. The Americans seized their Day 3 objectives in the airfields. Also, Marine strike planes started to land, the first to be on official Japanese soil. L-Day was also when the first groups of Okinawans were contacted. Right off the bat, many Americans felt a connection with the Okinawans. Eugene Sledge had this to say. "The children won our hearts. Nearly all of us gave them all the candy and rations we could spare. They were quicker to lose fear of us than the older people, and we had some good laughs with them." Whenever given something like a can of peaches, the Okinawans bowed in respect and took the gift. Kids were given chocolate bars and medical care. In the internment camps established, the only real problem was getting old Okinawan women to use the latrines. But make no mistake, the military government units were here to treat the Okinawans as a hostile population. One American general noted that, "We aren't here to play Santa Claus." All Marine and Army forces were briefed that the locals' only source of information was that of Japan, and to expect the Okinawans to hate them. They were still ordered, though, to save as many lives as possible. To the Americans, the Okinawans were something different. An unusual person who lived in poverty but still retained many morals that the Americans had not expected from a Japanese-controlled island. Some had even been to the United States. On L-Day, one cave was filled with Okinawans who were terrified of the Americans, making the motion of slitting their throats as the Americans approached. They were ultimately convinced by a UCLA student that had spent time in America that the Americans were not murderous savages. They surrendered, thankfully. Because of her, dozens of lives were saved. As they were all coming out of the cave, One American private said about her, "Boy, I'd like to fuck her." All the Americans were taken back when she had said in perfect English, "Please don't do that." It was also noted by the Americans that all able-bodied males were gone. It was only elderly, women, and children. They almost all hid in caves. The old women would cover themselves in quilts until American soldiers pulled them off of them. Then they would drop to their knees and beg for their lives. The situation the Okinawans found themselves in is tragic and extremely complex. I'll do my best to cover it in this series. These people, for the most part, have been forgotten in history, but their story needs to be told. Overall, the L-Day landing was a massive success. Losses were unbelievably light, and the Americans were able to capture their objectives days ahead of schedule. One of the most destructive events in American military history had been avoided, thankfully. As was planned, the Marines planned to head north, and the Army head south. The Americans now even held out a small hope that Okinawa was going to be easy. The Americans were wrong to hope for it. The Japanese never planned to contest the landing, and if any units would have, they would have been limited. Now the Americans had landed on Okinawa, and over 80,000 Japanese soldiers and Okinawan conscripts waited for them in caves in the south. Around this time, Radio Tokyo put out one of their usual propaganda programs. Enjoy the music while you can, because when you're dead, you're a long time dead. Let's have a little jukebox music for the boys and make it hot. The boys are going to catch hell soon, and they might as well get used to the heat. Before I end the video, here's some interesting factoids and facts that I couldn't really put in the rest of it. First off, the USS Franklin. I previously talked about how some of the men were blown off, or jumped off. Believe it or not, they were actually all brought up on desertion charges, which is funny. But these didn't go anywhere, and they were all dropped once they returned to Pearl Harbor. Another interesting factoid, or fact, or whatever you want to call it, comes from L-Day itself. So after the beachhead was captured, the Marines and Army troops started moving inland, capturing their objectives and whatnot. Well, they actually discovered a lot more bunkers than they would have liked, and these bunkers were intact. And there were also cave systems found that were completely intact too. They were all abandoned though. However, if the Japanese did decide to contest the landing, it would have been a lot bloodier than what was thought. So those are some interesting things I wanted to share. Next time, we're going to be talking about the North and Aishima and the battle that went on there. Here are my sources. Hope you guys liked the video, and please subscribe. Thank you.